part of that, then come back around 5 o'clock. I think the doors open at 4. Pray for us this afternoon, Sue, myself, Robbie, several others who will be involved. We have the security, we have the parking and sound and stuff like that, so just be praying for us because we'll be busy all afternoon. But it's just an opportunity to be together, to fellowship together. If you come back out, just expect that it's probably going to be a little bit different music than what you're used to listening to. But they really do a good job. And Christian Cunningham will be here tonight, which some of you follow Christian probably on like the Today Show and that sort of thing, local talent. And so come back out and support them if you would. Another thing I want to make mention of is that last Wednesday evening, Jim Curry and his son Wesley, Jim, you can wave back there if you will. Jim is the big guy in the back. Some of you, if you were here last week, you know that I went to put my arm around Jim, and it's like, hey, Pops. I mean, he's a big man. And second most challenging baptism I think I've ever done. So, I mean that in a good way. You're just a big guy, dude. So how tall are you? What are you? 6'3". Well, in the water you seem more like 6'5" or 6'6" or something like that. But anyway, they were baptized last Wednesday night, and so congratulations to them. And be praying for he and Wesley as they kind of plug in and get more involved. And it's just good to have them as part of the church. And then we want to make, let's see, trying to think of what. I want to let you guys know Brock and Emily are now in their new home. They live on 30 Dixie Acres, and so Jennifer and I are empty nesters again, and it's a little weird. They've left the dog with us so far, and we'd rather them left Riker and taken the dog, but they left the dog with us. So be praying for them as they get their new beginning there. And man, there was prayer request for Jeff Lane. I just want to mention Jeff because Jeff attended, he was in St. Louis last night at the Cubs-Cardinals game. And of all the games to go to, some of you probably don't know this, some of you don't really care, but Jeff is a Chicago Cub fan. I am a St. Louis Cardinal fan. Will be mainly because I follow God, but anyway, last night in the 7th inning, the Cardinals scored 12 runs, and they beat Chicago 12-0. And here's the deal: the 12 runs tied a franchise record for the most runs in a single inning. And there were 7 doubles during the 7th inning, tied a record from 1936 for the most doubles in a single inning. And so of all the games for poor Jeff to go to, he hits that one. So just be praying that his spirits are lifted in some way, because I think he was kind of down. And then, on a little bit more serious note, I just want to take the next couple minutes to pray for the victims and their families of the shooting in Colorado. I can't even imagine. I mean, if you stop and think about, you may have been a family out together for that night. You might have been a young man or a young woman, and you're on a date, and then all of a sudden it's just, it's interrupted in that way, and just by senseless violence. And it may seem a little strange, but I also want to be praying for this young man, Holmes is his last name. I'd like to be praying for him simply because with him, I really don't believe it's simply an emotional and a mental problem. I think what we see in him is a very angry young man, and we don't know why. So we just want to lift the whole situation up. And so we're just going to pause for a minute and pray for them. So if you bow with me, please. Our Father in God, we come before you, and from time to time there are just things that happen that just seem so senseless. And we're reminded once again that the prince of this earth is an evil one who seeks to destroy, seeks to influence those that he might. And he does that in so many different ways. He does it through anger. He does it through emotional, just an imbalance there. And Father, we're not exactly sure what's going on with this young man, but the one thing that we know, just like we mentioned in the song, you love him as well. And so I pray, Father, that as a community there begins to grow angry, and that's simply one of the stages of grief and mourning. There's the shock and the unbelief, the maybe perhaps even denial, but Father, one of the stages is to be angry, and that community is all the folks there are going to go through that at some point. And I just pray that in some way that you raise your church through the congregations that are there, and that, Father, you would minister to the victims and their families, that Father, you would help them to be comforted as they mourn. That's your promise, that not that we won't mourn, but that you will comfort us in that mourning. And so, Father, use individuals, and I'm thankful for those who've gathered there to help, to counsel and to just cry with family members, and just to pray with them and to support them. And so, Father, we pray that continue, that your hand of blessing be upon the families of these victims. And we pray, Father, that in some way this young man might be reached. We know that he's going to have to pay the penalty of his crime, and there are consequences for what he's done. But Father, we also know that you do love him, and that you want him to come to you as much as anyone else. And that's, I know for many, many people, including Christian people, that's a struggle. But Father, it's why you're God and we're not. And so, Father, we come before him, we ask mercy, and we ask grace, and we especially ask peace. May your hand be upon that whole community, and may we remember them often in our prayers. For we pray through Christ's name. Amen. And thank you. Well, this morning we start a new series called Living Our Mission, and it made sense to me coming out of the book of Revelation that we would go to this, I guess, this direction. And in talking about being witnesses for his work, this is part one. I kind of switched gears this week in where I wanted to go with this. Originally, I thought about talking about the work of Northland Christian Church and Old Union Church of Christ, and I just briefly touch on that for 40 years, Northland was a light to North Danville and had an influence in this part of town. And then in talking about Old Union, that for 175, 180 years, they have been present in Vermilion County at a couple different locations. The one that we left there in the country, they had been there for 160 years, something like that. And so, these two congregations had kind of a rich heritage. And originally that's what I was going to talk about, and then God kind of took me a different direction, and I decided to even go further back than that in talking about being witnesses for his work, going back, historically speaking, even to the eyewitnesses, and that took me to the Gospels. And so I'm in great debt to a fellow by the name of Dr. Tim Keller for a lot of the information that's in this message. Tim Keller is the pastor at Christ Redeemer Church in Manhattan. He established the church there several years ago. There were 50 people there when he started. There are about 5,500 people who worship there now. And these are all folks who come from various backgrounds throughout New York, okay? And traditionally speaking, folks out east have been really hard to reach. It's just kind of a closed network, I guess, of people, and so it's been kind of tough to reach him. And so he's been very effective. Right now, he tours and is basically an apologist for Christianity. Apologist simply means offering a defense for what we believe. And most recently, I watched him online speak at Oxford University in London. And if you know anything about Oxford, it's very secular thought, and so he's really an effective guy. A lot of the information comes from two books that he has written that I have read, The Reason for God, and then his King's Cross, which is a commentary on the book of Mark, the Gospel of Mark. So this morning we're going to look at and ask this question of how and why was the early church so effective in their witness? Okay, and then we're going to try to bring that into a challenge for this morning. Why is it that the early church was so effective in their witness? And the answer actually might surprise you a little bit. It's a very simple answer, and yet it may be something that just completely takes you off guard, but I really believe it to be true. Now, before I give you the answer, I want to do this. We have Wednesday evening services here, and here's a challenge I want to put out. Putting 100 people in here is like really nice, but I want to challenge you all to make Wednesday night a part of your weekly schedule, simply because you can't imagine, and I'm not yanking my own chain, I'm just simply saying you can't imagine what you miss out on with Wednesday nights. It's really kind of an intimate setting. I do really more teaching than I do like preaching, and especially the next couple of Wednesdays, come and give it a try, because the next couple of Wednesdays we are actually going to have lectures by Dr. Keller. He won't be here in person, by the way. Sorry to disappoint you, but we're going to put him up on the screen. And so for about 35 minutes, he will lecture. And what he's going to be talking about is the reason for God. He's going to be talking about your neighbors and your loved ones. And while we're taking a look at being witnesses for God, it is very important that you understand that you are a witness. You've heard me say this before. Some of you have never heard me say this, but you will never forget this. You should never forget this. You are a witness. You're either a good one or you're a bad one. Okay? And what we want to be is a congregation of good, faithful witnesses. And so come out, and then what we'll do after the 35 minutes, then we'll have question and answers. Again, you don't get to ask him questions, but you get to ask me questions, and I'll do my best to present the answers. And so come out and be a part of that, 6 o'clock Wednesday night. Now, back to the question, what is it that made them so effective? And again, this might completely surprise you, might just blow you out of the water. It is because they believed without a doubt that the gospel message of Jesus Christ was true. Now, what that means is, and I know this, there are many, many of you who may never admit this, but many people today still hold on to the stories of Jesus, the gospel stories, the message of God and His grace and His mercy. And you hold on to it in a way as if you want to believe it, but you're not entirely convinced that it's true. And so this morning we're going to talk about that subject, witnesses for His work. See, all God is calling us to do is to participate in His work. And I would make that clear to you. It is His work. It's not your work, and it's not my work. One of the things that I would actually disagree with, even though I think it's something that we do absolutely pray, if you heard me say in the song or the words, Father, hear my prayer, I need, do you remember the next line? I need the perfect words. Words that He will hear and know they're straight from you. And the thing is, I think we do pray that prayer, but the truth is, I'm not sure there are any perfect words. I could stand up here and I could give the most convincing argument. I could be passionate about it. I could have everything that everyone wants, just the right amount of illustrations, just the right amount of humor, just the right amount of raising my voice. And there will still be people who leave here not convinced and not believing. And so what I want you to understand, it is very much His work. In fact, that's exactly what this passage in Romans 1:16 says. I am not ashamed of the gospel of Christ, for it is the power of God. And I hope that you hear that in the message, in the gospel, in the gospels, in the truth. That is the power. It's the power of God unto salvation to everyone that believeth, to the Jew first and also to the Greek. And so the power is with God. It's in the message itself. And how we go about presenting it, really the thing that should be said is, are we presenting it? I remember an illustration one time about, I just went blank on his name. What's the seminary up in Chicago? Moody. Moody was once told by someone who attended one of his services. They said, Mr. Moody, this lady says, Mr. Moody, I don't particularly care for the way that you go about evangelism. And to which Moody said, well, you know what? I'm not entirely convinced it's the best way either, so how do you do it? And the woman says, well, I don't do it. And so Moody responded in this way, well, I much more like and care about the way that I don't do it well than the fact that you don't do it at all. And so I come back around to that what God calls us to be, it's not so much that we have to have the perfect words, it's the fact that we are willing to tell the story, that we're willing to share. And it's amazing to me that we become so passionate about things. And in fact, let me go back and use the Cardinal Cub thing. That there are actually, in this room right now, Cub fans. Really? I'm picking on you, I know. But listen, and the thing is, as miserably as the Cardinals can play, and I will gladly admit that they can play miserably sometimes, I'm still a fan, and I'm going to be outspoken. We talk about things like that, don't we? We talk about our favorite football team or our favorite basketball team, and we're passionate about it. We talk about Chevy versus Ford, and we talk about Harley Davidson versus Victory motorcycles, and we're so willing to talk about those things. And so I come back around and I ask this question, why aren't we willing to talk about Jesus? Is it possible that, in fact, part of the problem is you want to believe, but you don't actually know if it's really true? Jesus said to Thomas, blessed are you, Thomas, because you believe. He said, Lord, I believe. You know why he believed? Because he was able to touch the nail prints in his hand and the wound in his side. And Jesus went on and said, but more blessed are those who have not seen me and yet they believe. But I will be honest with you and tell you that it is sometimes difficult that when God is not so tangible, when we can't touch Him, when we can't feel Him, when we can't really speak with Him face to face, that sometimes for people the doubts sneak in. And I'm entirely convinced that the reason that many, many people in the church do not share their faith and are not witnesses is because they still have some doubts and they don't really believe. And so that's where we're bombarded with it all the time, aren't we? Turn on the History Channel, the Discovery Channel, National Geographic, and there's always going to be someone who's saying, here's the reason you should have some doubts. Well, my job today is to give you some reasons of why you should not doubt. That is absolutely true. And if you're taking notes, the very first thing I want to talk about is that the Gospels are true. The Gospels are true. See, here's our struggle. Around 120 to 140 years ago, people within the church and actually scholars within the church, authors, were convinced that the Gospels were not actually written by Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. They were written by pseudo-authors more than 100 years after Jesus. Now, you may not think that that's problematic, but it very much is, because what they were espousing is the fact that if that's true, then by that time, oral tradition had become legend. And so some of the things that Jesus said, according to these scholars 120 to 140 years ago, some of the things that Jesus said, he really didn't say. And some of the things that he did, he really didn't do. It had just grown. As you tell the story, it's like the old game of telephone. By the time you get around the circle, the story's completely changed, and usually it's grandiose. And so that presented a problem. I mean, if what you're actually believing in is oral tradition and it's legend and it's not really real, then why should you go out and share it with anyone else? Why would you want to if you're not sure yourself? Well, in the late 1960s, something happened. While the rest of society was saying God is dead, and some of you remember that, the headlines in one of the New York newspapers and Chicago newspaper simply said God is dead. As society was beginning to say, well, God is dead, he's really not there, some of the scholars began to revisit the Gospels and the Bible, and they began to take a critical look at it, and they began to discover that, in fact, they really were written by Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and they were written within 50 years of Jesus' death. Now, folks, that's important. And it meant that this isn't so much oral tradition, it's actually eyewitness accounts. And so what I want to present for you in this first heading, the Gospels are true, are seven arguments, and I promise that I'm going to go through them pretty quickly. Okay, I promise I'll go through them in a few minutes. But seven arguments of why the Gospels are true, okay? Why they are eyewitness accounts. Number one, a fellow by the name of Papias or Papias, or I don't know, he was one of the early church fathers. Anybody in here ever heard his name before? Papias, okay? Well, Julia has, because she was in first service. But basically, he's one of the early church fathers. Now, we call them church fathers even though they were in the 2nd century, and they would probably really be offended if we call them church fathers, because they would have told you that the apostles were the actual church fathers. But that's how we characterize them when we're talking about history and trying to date that time. Papias was one of the early church fathers, and he says that in 80 AD, basically 50 years after Jesus, in 80 AD, there was present within the church 3 generations of believers. One was new disciples, and the new disciples were being trained by the elders. I would guess that as a kid, Papias would have been a new disciple. Then there were elders of the church. These elders of the church were people like Polycarp, who studied under the Apostle John, okay? And then there were eyewitnesses, okay? So 3 generations. Eyewitnesses to Jesus' resurrection. Elders of the church that sat at their feet. And new disciples. Now, why is that significant? Because in every prominent church, according to Papias, in every prominent church throughout the Roman world, there were present their eyewitnesses. Now, you guys may not remember this, but some people say the eyewitnesses to the resurrection were very few. In fact, most know that the apostles were eyewitnesses. The Apostle Paul is an eyewitness to the resurrection. He says that I'm an apostle born out of due season, which means that he meets Jesus later on, but he still meets the risen Jesus. But the Gospels tell us that Jesus appeared to as many as 500 people at once after his resurrection. And so Papias says that these 500, because of persecution in Jerusalem, were spread all over the Roman world and all throughout the churches. They are present in the churches. Why is that important? Because if someone shows up and says, well, I once heard Jesus say this, here is an eyewitness who can say, listen, I was there, and that's not true. Are you following the logic of this? The eyewitnesses were critical because they basically controlled what was said about Jesus and what wasn't. Or what was true about Jesus and what wasn't. They regulated whether or not legend came into it. And so they were present. Let me give you kind of a modern day example. A few days ago, Brock came to me and said, hey, Miles, he said, I got to tell you this story. He said, this guy that works with a friend of mine said to him, hey, I knew Miles before he became a preacher. And that dude was wild. Those were his words. Now, I have my issues and stuff, and I was kind of crazy, but to characterize me as absolutely wild, I don't think that's real fair. Do you, mother? Okay, we may be asking the wrong person. And so Brock decided to check it out a little bit more, and so he said to his friend, Mike, he said, Mike, who told you that? And so Mike told him the guy's name, and here's the deal. This kid who told Mike that I was really wild and he knew me before I was a preacher, I coached him in football a few years ago while I was a preacher. Okay? Now, here's the deal. I don't know why people have to do that other than to make themselves feel important in some way. But basically, he made up this story to Mike and telling him, I knew Miles before he became a preacher, which was absolutely not true, and that he was really wild. Now, how he would have any indication of that when I saw him maybe for 2 hours a day and coached him in some games, I have no idea how he made that determination. But there's the story. And what Brock was able to do, because Brock is an eyewitness, okay, he was able to say, listen, I know that kid and I know my father-in-law, and that's not true. He didn't even know. He wasn't even born before I became a preacher. Okay, so you follow what Papias is saying. Papias is saying that there were eyewitnesses present in the prominent church. There were eyewitnesses present when the Gospels were written. In fact, they're written by eyewitnesses, and we'll get to that in just a second. Number two, second argument. There are 4 Gospels, 4 of them: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Okay? The first 3 are what we call synoptic Gospels. That means that they agree with one another. They're very similar to one another. John's a little bit different aspect. But if the church, here's the point, if the church was going to make up information concerning Jesus and his work, don't you think it would be much easier to just provide one gospel? You know, the authorized version? But we'll just do one story, because with 4 stories, it's a little hard to keep the details straight if we're making this up. And so the fact that there are 4 accounts demonstrates that the writers were not trying to fool anyone or misrepresent the truth. 4 different people essentially say the same thing about Jesus, with the exception of a few details. Number 3, the Gospels say that they are eyewitness accounts. Turn to Luke chapter 1, if you would. Luke chapter 1. Luke is writing to someone named Theophilus. And we really don't know who Theophilus is. Theophilus could be someone in an office. Theophilus could actually be this guy's name. Theophilus could be a reference to an entire group of people. We don't know. But he's writing to a fellow by the name of Theophilus, and this is what he says in the first 4 verses. Many have undertaken to draw up an account of the things that have been fulfilled among us, just as they were handed down to us by those who from the first were eyewitnesses and servants of the word. Therefore, since I myself have carefully investigated everything from the beginning, it seemed good also to me to write an orderly account for you, most excellent Theophilus, so that you may know the certainty of the things you have been taught. Does that sound like legend and oral tradition? He says, listen, I'm recording the things that I have learned from eyewitnesses and servants of God, servants of the Word. And I have carefully investigated all of this, everything from the beginning. And it seemed good also to me to write an orderly account so that you, most excellent Theophilus, so that you may know with certainty. I mean, that's a pretty straightforward claim. And then in the book of John, look at John chapter 20. John 20, verses 30 and 31. Jesus did many other miraculous signs in the presence of his disciples, which are not recorded in this book. But these are written that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that by believing you may have life in his name. Now, I know it doesn't mention eyewitnesses there, but here's why. Because John is an eyewitness. I have seen these things. These are the miracles that I saw him do. He did a lot more of them that I haven't recorded in the book. But I have recorded these so that you may believe. So that you may believe. So the Gospels themselves say that they are eyewitness accounts. Fourthly, the names that are included in the Scriptures. I mean, when you're making up stories and you use these names, by the way, well, let's go back on that. When you're telling a story and you use a person's name, there is the ability, there is the opportunity for the person that you're telling the story to then be able to go to the person that you have named. You got that? And so Mark names the blind man that Jesus heals. By the way, let's play a little Bible trivia. What is that blind man's name? What? Did you say Bartimaeus? Bartimaeus or Bartimaeus? Very good. You will get a cherry pie if there's any left, and I doubt it after being given to... There is a cherry pie. You win a cherry pie. All right. So Bartimaeus. And so essentially what Mark is saying is, if you don't believe me, then you can go and ask Bartimaeus, because Jesus healed him. Okay? Or in John's gospel, I think it's John. Yes, John, who mentions the servant. Remember at the Garden of Gethsemane, there's a servant whose ears cut off. Second round of Bible trivia. What was his name? You better remember that, Michael Jett. Michael Jett played Malchus in our Passion Play this year, and I was waiting. You know the really funny thing, the night that you had that, he had a huge plastic ear. That ear just kind of freaked everybody out. And but anyway, Malchus was his name. And so again, what John is saying is, if you don't believe me, then go and ask Malchus. Malchus may not have even been a believer, okay? I mean, he was a victim of Peter cutting his ear off, and then Jesus put it back on. And so go ask Malchus. Or how about this argument? Well, let me give this one. Mark chapter 15. In Mark chapter 15, he talks about how Jesus falls under the weight of his cross, and then a guy by the name of Simon from Cyrene had to pick up that cross and carry it for him. You guys remember that? And so he goes, Simon the Cyrene, yes, the father of Rufus and Alexander. So why mention Rufus and Alexander? Now, it could be that Rufus and Alexander were believers and they were a part of the church. And he's saying, go ask them. They'll tell you. Their dad carried Jesus' cross. They're kind of like footnotes. I mean, that's what we do with footnotes today. We basically say, if you don't believe me, then go check out the source for yourself. And so they're little footnotes. I like this argument, by the way. In one of the Gospels, it mentions the two disciples on the road to Emmaus. And one of them is named. Only one of them. You will get a Hostess cherry pie and a ding dong. Huh? Okay, so you get a Hostess cherry pie and some muffins if you answer this one. What was the disciple's name on the road to Emmaus? The one who was named. What? Cleopas. Thank you. So you get those two prizes. Cleopas. Now here's the point with that. If you are making up the story, why do you just name one of them? If you're making it up. If you're making it up, you don't name either one of them, or you name both of them. Do you follow that? Because here's what happens. When they record that, he may have known at one time, he may have known both their names, but at the time that he's writing it down, he can only think of his name. And so he writes it down. I mean, that's the way an eyewitness account works. You know, you may remember this detail, but you don't remember this one. And so one of them is named. So the names that are in the Bible are pretty much proof that they're true. Number 5, the unnecessary detail. C.S. Lewis once wrote, "Something will have to be said about the historicity of the Gospels. I was a literary critic, and I think I know the difference between legend and historical writing. In one sense, the Gospels are not good enough to be legend." Now, that sounds like such a terrible slam, but the truth is, he's saying if they were writing this like literature instead of historical fact, it would be better. Okay? And then he goes on to say, he says, if they are not history, then they are a realistic prose, kind of which did not exist before the 18th century. So if they're not really history and they are literature, here's the deal. That kind of literature didn't exist before the 1700s, but it's written in the first century. Okay? And the critics will come along and say, well, you know, they were that good. No. They were writing down what they remembered and what they believed and what they knew to be true. The Gospels are full of unnecessary detail. For example, a woman caught in an act of adultery, she's brought before Jesus, and Jesus kneels down and writes something in the dust. Unnecessary detail. Now, there have been sermons preached, books written on what Jesus wrote in the dust. And the truth is, we don't know what he wrote in the dust, and we don't know why he wrote in the dust. It's just that one of the gospel writers remembers that he wrote in the dust. It's an unnecessary detail. A couple of weeks ago, I preached about the 153 fish, and some of you remember that's in the book of John, the Gospel of John, John chapter 21, where they have this miraculous catch of fish, and they bring it in, and John says there were 153 of them. Now, you know that I preach, here's what people say about the 153, but the truth is, we don't know why he mentions 153, except for he remembered that there were 153 fish in the net. See, eyewitness accounts are vivid and they're full of detail, whether they're necessary or unnecessary. So that's the fifth reason that we should believe that the Gospels are true. Sixth, many of the stories and incidents are very inconvenient for the Bible characters. They're very inconvenient. And I want you to follow this. Academia and the critics of the Bible say that the early church doctored Jesus' sayings and teachings in order to support their agenda and policies. And I'm sure that you've heard that. I mean, if you ever watch anything about the Bible on History Channel or on Discovery or National Geographic, they will tell you how these sayings were not real, that they just did them in order to follow along with their agenda, their policies. And if that's true, then they really should have done a better job. They probably should have hired a marketing strategist, okay? Because some of the things that they say are really not convenient for the church. For example, who was the first person to find the empty tomb? Mary Magdalene. The women were the first to know that Jesus was resurrected, to see the resurrected Christ. In Jesus' day, and you guys know this, in Jesus' day, being a woman was difficult. Your testimony was not accepted in Jewish courts. You weren't dependable. So if they're making up this story about Jesus rising from the dead and all about Jesus, why would you choose that it's women who see him first? Does that make sense? No, I mean, to me that would be rather foolish. Let's do this. Let's tell them a woman found him. Whoa. Thought I was going to go down there for a minute. Another illustration, Peter. You know, Peter, we've covered this over the last few weeks, but Peter denies Jesus. And I know we're going long, but hang in there. Montana mics will still be open. You can blame it on Bruce. His offering meditation was... Huh? That's true. You can blame it on Bruce, but he did give you a snack to hold you over while I preach long. Peter, he's predicted, he says to Jesus, he said, listen, even if everybody else falls away, I will not fall. I'll die with you. And then before the night was over, there's a rooster crowing in the background, and 3 times. In fact, the 3rd time it says that he calls down curses. And we're not really sure what that means exactly, but it could mean that he actually called down curses upon Jesus. I don't know him. I swear by God I don't know him, and here's what I think about him. I mean, that's a bad thing, right? So can you imagine? They're making up the gospel, and Peter comes along and says, I got a story for you. Let's put this one in there. Everybody, it'll be a hoot. The Gospels are true because it doesn't hide anything. In fact, I've been reading a book by Kyle Idleman, Not a Fan. And you guys, the country went crazy over the book, and I mean, rightfully so. It's really, really well written. But in the book, what Kyle talks about is how he ministers at Southeastern Louisville. Southeast, I think he had like 20,000 members or something like that. And so every week he says that he sits down and he visits with 2 to 22 visitors. Actually, 2 to 22 people who are thinking about making that their church home. And he says, when I sat down with them, there are basically 2 different groups of people. There are those who you know they have a history with the church. And he said the really sad thing is that people who come to our church who have a history with the church often come in and they know the church talk. And so we're trying to sit around this table and be real and yet they're not willing to be real. They hide things from you. They hide their habits and their behaviors and their struggles, and they hide their shortcomings. He said new people, new believers don't do that. He said they'll come in, they'll tell you about all the addictions that they have. They'll tell you about the multiple affairs that they've had. They'll tell you about all these things. And you know what I have learned through dealing with the church? How true that is? That there are some people who've been in the church for so long that they've forgotten that they're actually sinners. That they're not perfect. And so they try to hide all that from each other rather than being willing to share with each other. Listen, I'm having struggles. And so understand that part of the reason the Bible is true is because why in the world would they tell the stories about themselves if they're making it up? I mean, why would they be that transparent if they're actually making all of those things up? The seventh reason that the Gospels are true, because it was written by involved observers. Now here's what I want to tell you. There's an objection by many critics. They say that they don't believe the Bible because they say that it isn't written by detached observers. Now, it's kind of, I hope you're following what I'm saying. Involved observers are those who are a part of it. Detached observers are those who are outside of it writing about it. But can I tell you something that I've learned through my years? And some of you may think, well, you're not all that old. Well, I am going to be 50, so I may be older than you actually think that I am. And secondly, I've been doing this for a long time. And what I have learned is that if you're going to write about something, if you're going to report something, if you're going to espouse something, you cannot be detached. And there'll be someone in here, I guarantee it. Someone, so I'm heading you off. Someone would approach me afterwards if I leave it there and they'll say, what about news reporters? Let me tell you something. Every network that I know of states that it is fair and impartial and balanced news. And that's a load of crud. They have their own agenda. And I can tell you the networks. Any of the major networks, ABC, NBC, CBS, CNN. Well, I'm going to stop there because all of them will really report. They have their agenda. And I'm just going to lay it out there. It's more of a democratic agenda. Now, Fox comes on the scene, and Fox says, we are fair and we are balanced. Baloney. Because if you listen to them, they are more Republican. And so there is no one out there that is fair and balanced. They aren't. You don't talk about things that you're not passionate about. I'm not faulting any of them. I'm just saying let's be realistic. They are not presenting fair and balanced news. It's always coming from their slant. And so I honestly think this is a ridiculous argument to say that you can't depend upon something to be true if you are an involved observer. And what I'll use is this. We prayed about it already, so I want to use this illustration. Many of us watch the news Friday morning, and the theater shooting was the main topic. So let me say this. There were several interviews aired with people who were eyewitnesses, people who were directly involved. Can we trust what they say? Yes. Now, there's always the matter of perspective. There's always the matter of interpretation. That's always there. But we can trust what they say because they were there. They were eyewitnesses. Or to take it a little further, what about Holocaust survivors? I mean, can you imagine coming on the scene and saying, can the things they witnessed actually be believed? I mean, after all, they were involved observers in this. And they needed to be detached to truly present to us the truth. Well, that's crud. I'm doing my best not to say crap. Okay. That's crazy. So it makes sense to me that this whole argument about involved or detached observers just doesn't hold any water. Of course they were involved observers, but that should reinforce the fact that they're telling us the truth because they were there. They are eyewitnesses. All right, number 2, okay, and I'll go through this real quick. Number 1, the Gospels are true. Number 2, the Gospels are true stories about Jesus. Okay? Most critics and even a lot of folks who are sincerely searching, they do so by asking intellectual or philosophical questions. You know, they come to you. Probably one of the most basic questions that a person who's truly searching for Christ or for God will ask is, why is there so much suffering? Okay? They want a philosophical answer. They want a watertight argument is what they want. They want to ask me to prove the existence of God or to ask you to prove the existence of God. And that's not our job. It's His work. We are to be witnesses. We are to give testimony. And I love the response given by a pastor out east. His name is Dick Lucas. And he was once asked, can you give me a watertight answer of why I should believe in Jesus, why I should believe in God? And he said, what if God decides to give you a watertight person instead? To which the young man who asked said, well, what do you mean? And Lucas went on to explain that in Jesus there are 2 things fulfilled that are not fulfilled in any other human being, any other person who's lived. Number 1, Jesus made a claim that He was God. Now some of you will say, well, He's not the first person to do that, and you are correct. He will not be the last person to do it. There's a fellow right now in the Hispanic community who proclaims that he is Jesus Christ incarnate back on earth. And here's the deal. He's not the first person to make that claim. Won't be the last one. But Lucas goes on and explains that Jesus was also kind, compassionate. He served others. He gave. He gave to the extent that He gave His very life on the cross. And someone will say, well, He's not the only one who has lived that kind of philanthropy in their lives. And you are correct. Most recently, a Mother Teresa would be an example of someone who was loving and kind and compassionate. She even took the money that she won from the Nobel Peace Prize and she used it to feed the children there in India. So Jesus isn't the first one to come on the scene to claim to be God, and He's not the only one on the scene who is good and compassionate and kind, but He is the only one who is a combination of those 2 things. See those who, Mother Teresa, let's just use her as an example, she never claimed to be God. Okay? She knew she wasn't God. And those that claimed to be God were certainly not kind and compassionate. Men like Claudius and Nero, emperors who claimed to be God.